Now, is this really the price increase though? Now, as we saw in chapter 3, when we implement a tax, right, the actual price increase, meaning the price that consumer pays, really depends on the relative elasticity of supply and demand. Right. So let's take a look. What do we mean by that? So just two quick sketches so we can illustrate. Remember in chapter 3, whenever we whenever implement a tax, right, it's simply a wedge. And so here is the old price. Now, forget about the price that producers get for now. Let's just look at the price that consumers pay. Right? And now, this wedge here, right? That is the carbon tax. Right? Think of that as maybe the $40. Oh, sorry, the $105 that we would be expecting here. But really, the actual price change is here. Now, how much of this? How much of this increase, depending on the shape of the demand and the supply, right? Because if I illustrate and just try this on your own, right? You can draw, for example, a much more elastic a much more inelastic demand and a more elastic supply, and what's going to happen, right? We see here, right, same wedge, and yet notice now most of the price increase is going towards the consumer, right? The consumer will bear most of the burden. Okay, and this is an important part about any tax policy. Right? The government cannot control who actually end up bearing the burden of the tax. Right? It really depends on the market. It really depends on the market condition. Okay. So the goal of the tax is to reduce consumption. Okay. The who pays and does consumption actually change? Right? So we look at price and quantity change. So first of all, right, let's not lose sight. Does the carbon tax work? Well, the short answer is yes. The carbon tax does work. Right? So here we have some data comparing gasoline prices versus consumption in different industrialized countries, and we see here clearly that the United States, by far, we have the most consumption in gallons per person, and in Europe, let's look at the European countries. Right? The prices there, they're much they consume on a fraction what a U.S. consumer consumes on average. Now, so what is this? So why is this? Well, because in Europe, look at their prices. Right? Their prices are almost four times higher than those in the United States. Now, I must say that gasoline, it is a global is a commodity that is sold globally. There is really only one price for gasoline. The United States doesn't have any special. We might have some advantages, but not nearly as much advantage to explain this price difference. What I mean by that is this price here, this additional increase in price has to do with the gasoline tax that European countries impose. Right. Now, the reason why they could reduce consumption so much, though, is that in most of these countries, their gasoline tax that they implement, they take the gasoline tax and they invest heavily. They invest heavily in public transportation. The goal of that is to create alternatives, and because again, elasticity is the key here. If the demand is very inelastic, let's say, for example, right, if gas prices double tomorrow, right, for a lot of people, they will have no choice but to pay the extra a higher price because they still have to go to work and they have to commute and they also have to commute, right? And so when we look at elasticity of demand, right, we have to look at short term versus long term. Right? And short term demand will always be less elastic than long term demand. In the short run, you have no choice. You still have to go to work, so you will pay the higher tax price, meaning that your consumption is not going to reduce that much. So the tax has no, so at least we're not getting the effect that we want out of the tax. However, in the long run, right, you have more options. You can either move closer to your workplace, you can switch to a more fuel efficient cars, or you might even change jobs, right, etc. And so in the long run, people will always have more, people's demand will be more elastic, and then they could finally reduce consumption, right? But the problem is, right, who really ends up paying for the who end up paying for the tax, especially in the short run. The people who end up paying for the tax in the short run are the people who have no options, who can't choose, right? So we saw this a couple years ago, the yellow vest movement in France, right? And this was largely a protest on the new gasoline tax and the diesel tax, right? And usually working class people who who have no, who can't do remote work, and they need to commute, and they felt unfairly that the tax burden, right, is to fight climate change is placed on them, right? So so here we have a dilemma, right? So we have a dilemma is that gasoline tax does work, but it takes time. It takes time. It takes time for people's elasticity to change, and so that they can make or reduce consumption in the future, right? But we don't want to put the burden. But how do we alleviate the burden in the short run? Well, there is a method. So it's called a revenue neutral tax shift. Right? Now, a revenue neutral tax shift is comes in different variety, but overall, the fundamental idea is very simple. Is suppose we implement this carbon tax, and it's a tax on any carbon producing good, such as gasoline, right? Then we essentially the idea is basic. We Once we collect the tax, we will simply give the tax back to the taxpayer. Ideally, you want to give it back to the people who pay the tax. And you might have heard this idea of a substitution effect versus income effect in microeconomics. But the idea is that this will still, at the end of the day, cause a decision change. And so this will still make carbon intensive fuel sources more expensive relative to the other fuel sources. And so even though at the end we are giving the tax back to the people who paid it, they will still be incentivized to make the change. Okay, and so this helps with alleviating this burden in the short run, right? That we have placed on the economy and on the people, right? In order to reduce consumption. Okay, here's a video. This is a very great successful case that is done in British Columbia, and I think looking just take a watch here, and that will really help you understand a little bit more about a revenue neutral tax scheme.